next up, our next panel will be focusing on the question of how we can foster digital inclusion in the UK. So I believe they should be coming in a second, but our... Oh, perfect. Okay, so our panel chair is Professor Ellen Hesper, the Professor of Socio-Digital Inequalities at the London School of Economics. We've got Lord Clement Jones, the House of Lords Liberal Democrat spokesperson for Science, Innovation and Technology. Professor Lizzie Coles-Kemp, the head of the Department of Information Security at Royal Holloway, University of London. And finally, we've got Helen Milner, OBE, the Group Chief Executive of the Good Things Foundation. Thank you very much.
Okay, let me see if I can get the technology to work. I'll wait until everybody sits. I think on behalf of all the panelists, I will say thank you for inviting us and giving us the opportunity to share our knowledge and expertise and ideas around digital inclusion and how we can foster it in the UK. We will organize this panel roundtable discussion in a way that I'll first ask my colleagues to introduce themselves on the panel, and then we will have two questions. Wonder if we can, they said they might be up on the, there we are. Two rounds of questions. One, we'll start with talking about what we already know and what works for whom, and each of us will share our ideas and knowledge about this, and then we'll have a second round of questions around what to do in the next 10 years, or what can we do, and is it possible to eradicate digital exclusion? And then after that, we'll open the floor to questions. We'll try to respond to some of the points made on the panel, and then we'll open it up to questions. So hope to, I'm going to be a bit strict on sticking to time, so we have enough time for questions also from the people in the room. So I'll start. Helen, would you like to just introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about the work that you're doing, and then we'll ask everybody else.
Thanks, Ellen. Hi, everyone. I'm Helen Milner. I'm the Group Chief Executive at Good Things Foundation. We're a national and international digital inclusion charity. We work with thousands of hyper-local community organisations, so small local charities, community hubs, food banks, job centres, libraries. I call it a big club with a shared vision, because if you're interested in digital inclusion, if you're supporting excluded people in communities, then you can be in the club. It's all free. And predominantly what we do is we work with that network to help them to engage and support local people. So we work at scale. In things like the National Data Bank, so providing 500,000 SIMs for free internet connectivity to people who can't afford it, free refurbished devices that we get from private and public sector into the hands of people, but also of core skills and confidence. We work with partners like Nominet and Vodafone, Virgin Media, O2 and Accenture to make sure that we can make sure everything is free for people and for communities. And our goal is to help 1 million people over 3 years through our group outcomes to make sure that people are digitally able, equal and safe, so that they can be happier, healthier and better off. And I wanted to say that because I think it's really important we don't just focus on the digital, we focus on the impact that that then has on people's lives.
Thank you very much, Helen. Lizzie.
Thank you. I'm an academic and I specialise in digital security and privacy for socio-economically excluded groups. The department now has 3 people specialising in that area, and I think that shows how inclusive and accessible security and privacy has really grown as a topic. For the last 16 years, I've been working with communities to look at how community support works for safer digital access. We're looking at the types of threats that these groups particularly face and what that means for the design of technologies. And we've also been working on how technology, security and privacy technologies can be modified for groups in this position. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lizzie. Tim.
Thank you. I'm Tim James. Oh, so sorry, already failed the digital test. I'm Tim Clement-Jones. I'm the Lib Dem Science, Innovation and Technology spokesperson in the House of Lords. I used to be what it said on the tin, which was our digital spokesperson, and I slightly regret that I've had to, in a sense, expand the name of the title, because digital is what I'm really interested in. I've been an officer of the formerly, it was called the Data Poverty All-Party Group, now the Digital Inclusion All-Party Group, for quite a few years. And to my horror, I found that I was had my photograph at the very front of this report from the All-Party Group, because I was the only person still left in Parliament as one of the officers. But that doesn't mean to say that the report isn't very important, and it was our third and rather important report as a kind of wrap-up at the end of the last Parliament, which illustrated some of the lack of progress. But as well as everything else, I'm co-chair, and I founded the All-Party AI Group in Parliament because I thought there was far too little understanding, and I think writ large that is very true across the country of a lot of areas of data and digital, and we have a big job to do.
Thank you very much, Tim. I guess I should introduce myself as well before we start the question round. So I'm Ellen Helsper. I'm a professor of social and digital inequalities at the London School of Economics in the Media and Communications Department. And I am also leading a program on the politics of inequality at the International Inequalities Institute there. I'm also the director of the PhD program. And I have to say that we've seen a real increase in interest from applicants from around the world in actually studying this phenomenon in all its complexity. And I have myself been researching the links between historical and social and economic inequalities and marginalization and inequalities in an increasingly digital society globally, using a variety of different methods. Most of that work has taken place under the umbrella of the From Digital Skills to Tangible Outcomes project, which is a project that develops frameworks, measurement tools and kind of toolkits to better understand who is most at risk of not achieving the benefits, which is obviously important, part of inclusion, but also very much at looking at who is more at risk of the kind of more negative aspects of digitization, and the Baroness has already mentioned some of these. We look at this kind of holistically, so from studying systematic inequalities or differences between regions and people from different backgrounds in access, skills. Helen already mentioned that it's important to go beyond just the basics, right? But also in terms of for what kind of content is available, for whom, by whom is it made, and how do people engage with these technologies, and the different outcomes, you know, both the positive and the negative ones. We do surveys, interviews, we map regional and local inequalities and see how they change over time and what happens when people do an intervention in a region. Do people's lives improve if it's a digital intervention? And really important that for us, it's not about individuals being on or offline or being able to engage or not engage in a meaningful way, but it's about systematic differences between groups of people where policies and interventions can really make a difference to have that sustainable change and improvement in terms of socioeconomic and social kind of inequalities in increasingly digital societies. So that's my introduction. As you can see here on the screen, our first question that we will be discussing and giving our ideas about is, what do we already know about digital inclusion in the UK? What has and has not worked, and for whom? And I would like to invite Tim, if you would like to start. And I will time so that we get everybody through their points on time.
Thank you very much. And it's a great pleasure to be here this morning. And also, I think to follow Maggie Jones as well, because I think it shows a seriousness in government, which perhaps we haven't had quite before. So I do preface that I don't, I'm not yet in full oppositional mode. I'm still waiting for action, but I do think that there is a seriousness of purpose which is emerging. Whether the money to put behind the strategy is emerging is another question, and I think that's where the jury is out currently. But I think, everybody in this room will be completely on board with the fact that access to data, digital devices affects every aspect of our lives, our ability to learn, to work, to connect with online public services, to access necessary services from banking, healthcare, and to socialise and connect with family and friends. But I think it's taken quite some time for parliamentarians to wake up to these issues, mainly because they took time to wake up to what was happening more broadly in the digital economy. Just look at the online harms bill, which we talked about, Maggie talked about just a few minutes ago. And that took years to get on the statute book because there was a lack of understanding about the urgency that was needed in that respect. And I do pay tribute to Darren Jones, who is now the keeper of the purse in the Treasury, who founded what was called the Data Poverty All-Party Group, now the Digital Inclusion All-Party Group, in identifying that there was a serious gap in Parliament in terms of knowledge about digital inclusion and data poverty. And I think digital inclusion is a better way of describing it because it's not just about access to connectivity and technology, it's also about skills and understanding, which is crucial. And our last report, which I just waved, does express some of the issues. And it's not just the product of the pandemic, although clearly it exacerbated a lot of the digital exclusion issues. Now, the best report that I've found, strangely enough, and I'm not a great believer in always banging the drum for the House of Lords, is the Lords Communications and Digital Select Committee's report on digital inclusion back last year in June. And they highlighted the issues. Their report, strangely enough, was called Digital Exclusion. And they noted that 1.7 million households had no broadband or mobile internet access, 2.4 million adults were unable to complete a single basic task to get online, and 5 million workers will be acutely underskilled in basic skills by 2030. And they identified that broadband social tariffs, for instance, which of course were welcomed at the time, suffer from persistently low levels of uptake, with only 5% of eligible households signed up. And 4 in 10 households don't meet the minimum digital living standard. And crucially, 1 in 4 households with children have parents missing the critical skills for understanding and managing digital risk. So there's a whole raft of metrics by which we can easily identify that this is a major issue. And, the Local Government Association's report on the role of councils in tackling digital exclusion showed a very strong relationship between having fixed broadband and higher earnings and educational achievement. So the impact of digital exclusion is absolutely crucial. And I think the other aspect is the question of digital literacy. This is crucial if we're to ensure that people are in the driving seat, where increasingly, for instance, the use of AI is concerned. And it's very good to see that the next panel is about discussing AI regulation. And there's much good that technology can do, but we must ensure that we know who has power over our children, what values are in play when that power is exercised. And this is vital for their future and the proper functioning of our society.
Could I ask you to wrap up so that we have time for the
maintenance of public trust. Absolutely, I could go on forever. But I think the summary is that digital inclusion is critical to the future fair and democratic functioning of our society, and we need a concerted local and national effort to ensure it. So I'm looking for an update on a national digital inclusion strategy, which scandalously hasn't been updated since 2014.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed. So my position is always very much at the ground level, how we do digital inclusion and how we do that safely. I think, as we've just heard, a lot of really strong movements in terms of regulation, in terms of awareness, in terms of discussion, in terms of bringing groups together. And I see that on the ground in terms of doing. What I think we've done well is to raise it as an issue, to raise it as something that we need to do something about. And that's been very much followed up with toolkits and with frameworks. And Ellen describes some of the work that they've been doing. And I know that Helen does that on the ground. And that's really, really visible. So now we do talk about accessible and inclusive security and privacy technologies in a way that we wouldn't have done 5 years ago. We're thinking about this as a topic when we design access control into systems authentication, how we prove who we are, what we can do when we're online. So I think that's great. I think what's also really, where I think we've also really moved forward is that we think about what does it mean to design for diversity. And what we see on the ground is we see co-production, we see co-design coming in, and I think that's also really, really important. So I think that works well. Where I think we've still got a ways to go is I think that the implementation, at least for the work that we see, is not systemic. It's not systematically done. So what that means is that we quite often look at design of the technologies that I work with. It might be digital identity, it might be access control technologies, and then we have a working group on diversity and inclusion, and that's really useful because it brings out the issues. But we don't look at how our core design practices can be inclusive, can represent a broader range of diversity, can really think about these accessibility issues. So in the user journeys that we design, in the archetypes of the users, we tend to think about this in a slightly siloed, separate way. So it's a really interesting question about how we bring that in to the mainstream design. And I suspect that has a lot to do not with how we do it, and because we know how to do it, but it's about the economic and market models that underpin those technologies. How do we want to bake in diversity and inclusion from the ground up? And I think that's still a challenge for us. I think we've also got to ask ourselves, what is the goal here? Have we got it in our minds that we want to develop users of technology that are independent users in the way that we conceive, perhaps, of what that use should be? Independent, capable, skills. But the groups I work with, supported access, assisted access is what they want. It's how they want to go forward. So the way that some of the groups that I work with conceptualize access isn't just about independent use. It's often about co-use. It's often about collective use. And I think we need to take that on board. I think that there are a range of different types of inclusion. And I think we need to think about what that means and what that means for the end goal of inclusive design. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lizzie. Helen.
So on what do we know? We know a lot. I'm sure the three of us could probably stay here all day telling you what we know. One of the things we do at Good Things Foundation, we print this annual Digital Nation, which has kind of key stats and facts about digital inclusion. If you just search for Digital Nation on Good Things Foundation website, you'll find it. Tim's actually highlighted some of the key numbers on there. But one that I find absolutely shocking is that 33%, so 1/3 of people who are offline find it difficult to engage with the NHS. So the NHS, something we hold absolutely dear in this country, a universal service for everyone, but 1/3 of those people who are offline find it difficult to engage with it. So right now we have a 2-tier public service, and how wonderful was it to hear Baroness Jones say that it's absolutely crucial that digital inclusion is at the top of the agenda for the government, because it's going to absolutely underpin so many things. We know that interventions at the hyperlocal level work, right? So we know that it works not just because of trust, not just because of the support that they can offer, but because they reach the people who are excluded. There are still people who come to one of our partner digital inclusion hubs and say, I don't know how to use the internet and I heard you could help me. But there aren't that many of them. That mostly we work with these thousands of digital inclusion hubs, local partners who are already engaging with people because they don't speak English as a first language, and they want to have help with their English language, because they are absolutely on the breadline. They're coming for support, for food, for housing support, because they're coming because they have to get a job, they have to apply for benefits online. So it's a necessity, or they're already helping them. So one of the things that my question was, what's worked and what's not worked. Some of the not worked is, well, some of it's kind of emerging. So this is about actually how do we make sure that we fuel the flames of what's currently emerging. So, for example, an increased number of GP practices, hospitals, maternity nurses. We have 58 maternity nurses working on digital inclusion right now, because their day job is to help women who are pregnant. But they have so many apps and so many wonderful things that they can have online, but they realise that lots of those mums-to-be just could not afford the internet, so they can give them free SIMs. I was talking recently to the woman who is the health inequalities lead at a hospital trust. And they have joined the National Digital Inclusion Network, which basically means they can access the services. It's all free. But she did that because they have an online patients portal. And she was too often talking to patients who couldn't access the portal. And all of the good stuff that they were doing was on that portal. And she said to me, that do the people who design these portals know, do they ask themselves the question, who is helping people to use the portal? And she said, because they don't ask themselves that question. They have an absolute belief that every portal is just magically accessed by people. So that's about skills, it's about confidence, it's about affordability, so if you just don't have a device. So those local interventions work, but we need to ensure that we are doing this with embedded, I mean, you talk about tools, but embedded interventions. I also want to shout out to the private sector where Virgin Money, for example, all Virgin Money branches are local data banks. So that's where they can get free SIMs. And again, the people who are doing that are bank employees. They're people who are there to help people to access their banking. But because of their brand, because of their high street presence, that the local job centres, the local councils are signposting people there because they know that they can provide them with free connectivity when they come across people with free connectivity. And so this is absolutely about that multi-stakeholder, the cross-sector partnership that really needs to work. But I think there's so much, there's loads of really great stuff. A massive shout out to all those communities who are working so hard. But I still think that we need to accelerate and to amplify this.
Okay. Thank you very much, Helen. So it's my turn, last, but great to follow all this because I think it, covers many of the things that I think we do indeed already know. I mean, we can be optimistic in some ways because obviously many more people are online, especially in terms of simple access. During the pandemic, there was a huge effort to get especially young people who had to follow education, but also a lot of other efforts for people who couldn't reach the services that they desperately needed to survive. So there has been a great effort. UK is also leading in terms of the number of organizations that are involved, the policy involvement, the thinking around it in academia. And I would say it's a global player in that. So I think that's definitely positive. So while there are all these improvements, I think it's important to ask the second part of the question, for whom has this worked and for whom has this not worked? There are still significant inequalities in terms of the quality of connectivity based on where people live in the UK. Infrastructure, broadband was mentioned, but also 5G, there's huge inequalities in that. Also based on socioeconomic deprivation, it's strongly linked to people's household incomes and wealth. For example, 31% of people, research by Ofcom shows, who are in the lower income brackets, household income brackets, have only access to a smartphone. So they have access, but with that, it's not sufficient to participate fully to get the kind of to get into education or work, or to facilitate the types of active participation, that create content that is visible for people's stories to be heard, for people's life experience to be shared. So we get people using, but in a very passive way, and the online world is less and less representing who they are because of that. We also know, and this is related obviously, that serious issues remain in terms of skills. Even at the level of basic skills, and this is strongly related to education, formal education levels, but also in terms of what we might call more critical skills, in terms of the knowledge and understanding of how technology works and what impact they might have, when to use them and when not to use them, when it might actually be better not to disengage. In terms of how to evaluate information, misinformation was mentioned by Baroness, and to find quality services. So even the people who are online, especially are the people who have fewer educational resources or study in terms of literacy, traditional literacy, have a hard time once they're online actually getting the same quality out of the internet and other digital technologies. So while we are quite good in courses still, and this is an achievement at teaching kind of technical and operational and functional skills, how to use technologies, there is still a way to go to actually incorporate this more critical understanding, especially with AI that's coming up, because it's going to be less about how to use the technology and more to understand why the technology is giving you a certain recommendation to buy something, to go a different route, to use a certain service. We do not have enough knowledge, and I'm talking as an academic now, about really the inequalities in this area. Who's more subject to risks of misinformation, or who is more kind of at risk? And I think it's important here that what we do know is that the networks of support that Lizzie mentioned are extremely important. This is not an individual course-based thing or skills-based things. It's about the norms and the values and behaviors that we are observing in the people around us and how they engage, how they talk about technologies, how they engage with technologies in social and professional circles. And we still don't really understand enough about that kind of more like collective dynamic. The other area that I'm interested in, it was also mentioned this morning already, is another area where we don't have enough understanding is around the kind of inequalities in terms of psychological or socially kind of isolated, psychologically vulnerable or socially isolated people, and whether they might be more likely, there's some evidence to fall into these dependency cycles, to have negative engagement with technologies, which exposes them to bullying, harassment, and addiction. And there's a lot of noise in the media about this, but little nuance, I would say. And also, to a certain extent in policy, and while online safety acts are very important, it is also really important when we talk about inclusion to think about inequalities in this and who is more at risk and how can we design technologies so that especially, and it's not just children, this is across generation, this is about adults and the elderly as well who are more vulnerable. So that would be my contribution to this. I think we can swiftly move on to the next question, which is whether the panelists believe if we can eradicate digital exclusion in the next 10 years, let's be ambitious, in order to not exacerbate digital exclusion or to fix it, what needs to be done and by whom? And in this round, I would really like to start with Lizzie, if you would like to give your answer to that question.
Thank you very much indeed. To answer this question, I'd like to pick up on a point that Ellen's made, which is, what do we mean by access? Having an access point through a mobile phone, I think we all know that in this room, doesn't give you the kind of access that is needed necessarily for the services that we need to engage with. Helen talked about health, talked about education. This is if we want to develop enriched and empowered lives, then we need to think about access more broadly. Also, as has come up, I think, from all the panelists here, what's also really important is that we understand that this isn't a linear process. We're not on a journey to independent access. People, skills are needed at different times, capabilities, support is needed at different times in your life. And we need to we need to acknowledge that. So I think eradication is an important goal, but I think it's an ambitious goal unless we maybe break apart and decide what we mean by digital inclusion. I think fundamentally one of the really important points is that if we want to achieve this, we have to have the really difficult conversations about responsibility. Who is responsible for inclusion? Helen raised these most amazing partners, stakeholders that are working, but who is it? Who are responsible? This is multiple responsibilities. What roles do people play? So often in my area, in security and privacy, we see responsibilisation happening. What happens is that responsibility for safer digital access is pushed to the farthest point, which is the person with the access. And all the responsibilities for that safety sit pushed out to that end point, we would think about it in technical design, an endpoint that has no possibility of taking on those responsibilities, even if we thought it was fair for them to do so, and actually acting on those responsibilities. So I think we need to have a much tougher conversation about responsibilities, and we need to think about how those responsibilities are distributed and how we make sure that those responsibilities are followed through. Because without that, we really are going to go round and round in circles. So I think that is fundamental. I think we also have a bit of a challenge often with how we think about technology. It's the magic something that's going to make something work. It's the magic ingredient. So if we have a conflict or a disagreement around maybe a health policy, maybe an education policy, often we offload the fixing of that onto the technology, if we can just make it accessible. A really good example here is I've been working on digital technology to help with rehabilitation in the home. And I think about it in digital access control. I think about it in terms of digital inclusion. And then I'm brought up short. And I should know this, that actually if you can't do the rehabilitation exercise in the first place because you haven't got the support, you haven't got the space, you haven't got the confidence, no amount of having an app is going to help you get to that point. So I think we need to be really clear what the digital is doing and where the policy sits, and have some really honest conversations about that. From a security point of view, my plea would be, can we stop using access control and authentication technologies as a forcing function when we don't have that agreement? And I think about this time and time again in welfare policies, in digital identity policies, that we have to get agreement, because what happens is that security controls become the way that we try and make it happen. And I can tell you as a security person, that isn't going to work, because people have to buy into those controls if they're going to use them in the way that we intended them to be used. We have to have a way to bring the majority with us. And so it's really important that we get those really sticky conversations, we get those worked out and worked through.
Can I ask you to wrap up?
Yep. And the final thing I think to make this work is that we need to do more work in understanding the difference between people who are desperate to get access to a service and fraudsters and scammers. There was a terrific question in the last round about getting digital identity verified when you don't have all those documents. Time and time again, when we come across inclusive practices such as vouching, we hit a brick wall because the fraud argument comes in, and we need to do more work. Fraud and scams are really important that we deal with those, but we also need to find a way to manage that and manage inclusive access. And I think that needs more work. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Lizzie. Helen.
So, do I believe we can eradicate digital inclusion in the next 10 years? I think from our understanding of digital exclusion today, in 2024, I think the answer is yes. Obviously, in 10 years' time, our understanding of digital exclusion might be a little bit different. But I think that's one of the reasons why we absolutely need to focus on fixing that digital divide. I also think about, and what Lizzie and Ellen have said, absolutely, I agree with, that this is complex, and this is about deep inequalities, of which digital inequality is part of it. But the Labour Party came into power promising to fix the foundations, and those foundations include having access to the internet, being able to afford continued, sustained access to the internet. Can we fix that? Yes, we can, right? So I absolutely understand that the National Data Bank is a safety net. It's catching people who have already fallen, but it does give them free access to the internet. I have seen people weep with joy because we've given them a phone and free mobile connectivity for 12 to 24 months, 6 to 12 months, because of the impact on their life, because they can then get the support that they need, because they can then move on in some of the things that they're excluded from. But then on the other hand, the Nominate Digital Youth Index says that children should have access to a suitable internet-connected device, which normally means something like a laptop that you can do your homework on, right? So I think we need to understand those nuances, but do not underestimate. We must not stop giving people free connectivity and free phones because they don't have anything, but we do need to make sure that we understand the journey that people go on. This is absolutely cross-sector, so whom? Let's focus on the government. So they've said that it's absolutely crucial. They've said it's top of their agenda. They've said it's part of fixing their foundation. So we absolutely, as Tim said, need a strategy, but also an action plan. We're calling for an action plan by Christmas. We all know that this isn't just about DCIT. This has to be cross-government. And that's difficult, even with a government who's come in with mission-led, with their mission for opportunities. They're still human beings with, thousands of people working for them, kind of steering them into their silo. But we absolutely need to make sure that we keep on talking to the government, that it's not just about DCIT. It has to be about DWP. Every single job centre needs to be identifying people who are digitally excluded from day one and helping them or signposting them. DFE absolutely needs to fix the curriculum, all-age curriculum, to make sure that a proper digital skills fit for 2024, fit for 2034 is absolutely embedded in the curriculum, obviously the health service, etc., etc. This is absolutely about joining the dots between digital exclusion, digital inclusion, and productivity and growth. I really want to make that point, that if we shift just 2% of economic activity, so this is the long-term economically inactive, horrible term, but it's a reality. We're only at 78% economically active at the moment. If we shift that to 80%, that's 23 billion into our economy. Just imagine how different the budget would be in 2, 3, 4 years' time if we could fix that. And absolutely, those people are digitally excluded. Many of them are digitally excluded. We know 25% of people with a long-term health condition or a disability are digitally excluded. We need that hyper-local work. So if we're going to create and drive, Rachel Reeves said last week, a new approach to public services through the use of technology, I believe in that. I believe that technology can drive better, more efficient, more convenient public services, but we have to have that national network for all. We need that network to catch people who can't use those services, be that temporary or for the long term. And obviously thinking about AI, we've started work with AI literacy, particularly working with Accenture, but so that very basics. People today in our communities are worried about AI, just making sure they understand what that means for them and how they can have that critical thinking to see how that works for them. But really importantly, and just coming back to what I said at the very beginning, that yes, of course we need to fix access, yes, of course we need to fix skills, public services, making sure that people have that hyperlocal access, but we really do need to make sure that we understand that we're also building that confidence and agency that is really that the digital inclusion provides people with that equality to participate equally and safely in our society. And so I think we can. I think we all need to work together. And I'm really delighted that we have a government who's making the right words about their leadership on this subject for once.
Okay, thank you, Helen. So we agreed that I would be next, so I'll jump straight in. I think, this has been mentioned, and I won't kind of bang the same drum over and over again, but the question, do you believe we can eradicate digital exclusion in the next 10 years, is do we believe that we can eradicate exclusion in the next 10 years? And if we would put the question like that, I think people would say, like, well, that's a bit of a ambitious goal to set. But I think it's important to reiterate that because we are not going to tackle inequalities in access, in skills related to the digital if we don't tackle inequalities and exclusion in terms of access to education, access to health, access to meaningful quality employment, and if there's discrimination and harassment, if there's public figures who are using that kind of language and exposing that kind of behavior, this is going to be reflected in our digital world as well. I think it's also important to reiterate this point because I think one of the important things is if we're going to do this, and we were talking about who is responsible, I think we also need to think what are we responsible for when we talk about digital inclusion. And we've all mentioned the importance of the outcomes and the impact on people's lives and well-being. So the accountability, if we have policies or interventions, should not be how many phones have we handed out or how many people have we exposed to courses, but have their lives actually improved? Are we doing it in a way that actually makes people feel confident, safe, with kind of power to change their lives for the better? And there is some evidence that the way in which we're doing it, and that's why we have to be careful, is that actually kind of while people are more online, they are also, especially people who have lots of struggles in their lives, using the internet in a narrower way, having, kind of already mentioned the thing about mobile phones, access to fewer devices, are getting taught different kinds of skills than others. So we really need to look at that. So it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. We really need to understand the local context, as was already mentioned by Helen. This means meaningful consultancy around design, mentioned by Lizzie, around what is it actually that people want to and need to get out, not from a top to bottom, if you want to call it that, but really listen to people in terms of what they need. And that this is not going to be, it's not just a one-size-fits-all, that doesn't work, but it's also not a one-off, right? This is going to be a lifetime learning and support issue in where people are and when they need it, and in a collective way. I think one of the important things that we've been working with, that actually, especially with smart technology, smart cities, AI, is that the responsibility needs to shift a little bit because we've been talking about, people are being left behind and we need to upskill, but it's the people who are designing technologies, the people who are using technologies, especially technologies that learn from the behavior and the output of people that are online, that are shaping this future world in their image, right? So people are entering into a world where answers are given based on the experiences and needs of people who are not like them. So I think from the beginning, in terms of the design and in terms of skills and awareness creation, actually the emphasis needs to shift a little bit more on the people who are in an advantaged position, who are creating these digital technologies. And that is programmers, policymakers, but it's also ordinary users. And we can start that from a very young age. How do you think liking a certain type of content impacts other people? How do you think the algorithm decides that this is what somebody likes you want to see? What about somebody who's like you? What do you think the digital world is like for somebody else? Because that will create a collective awareness and leading to collective action. So I think this is kind of, for me, very important, that we don't just focus on people who are already struggling to get by, but that it's really all of our collective responsibility, and that we're collectively also culpable of creating a digital world that might not be that welcoming or friendly. So access infrastructure is still fundamentally important, but it's not sufficient to make it sustainable. And I think that involves all of us. It involves especially community organizations, and I will really congratulate Helen on the work that they have been doing, but also many other organizations in the UK on going to where the people are, doing the things that they want to do that are a benefit for them, and integrating the digital into that, just like the digital needs to be integrated across all the government departments. So the multi-stakeholder thing is a very important point for me as well. And I will leave it at that, and I will give the last word to Tim.
Thanks very much, Helen. I mean, it's pretty awe-inspiring listening to the solutions that other members of the panel are proposing. What I'd like to do is provide a bit of an envelope for that, because as you know, politicians can kind of make decisions, but actual delivery it needs to be willed in other ways. And I think what we have to be, if we're going to eliminate digital exclusion in the next 10 years, which is a huge, I mean, let's face it, when you look back over the last 10 years, we've seen all kinds of issues emerge. So the unintended consequences are the thing that bedevils government in that respect. So I think what we have to do is change our mindset. And I like to think of a broader digital citizenship. that there is an entitlement that drives a lot of the policies here. This isn't just something that we're doing because it does things to the economy. And, Good Things Foundation and the Digital Poverty Alliance have done great work in terms of estimating just how much the economy could grow with proper digital inclusion. But I think this should be much more of a rights-based approach. And I would like to see actually a digital Bill of Rights that would give an entitlement. I'd like to see the universal service obligation improved enormously as part of that. So it is an ambitious, holistic approach, effectively, to the delivery of a digital inclusion plan. What I'd like to see is a new government digital inclusion strategy. We need national level guidance. We need the resources and tools, many of which have been talked about today, that support local digital inclusion initiatives. But even if DCIT is in the saddle, and as Lizzie said, there needs to be much greater clarity around leadership, much more effective mechanisms for coordinating government departments' efforts. And, Helen described graphically the kind of different government departments involved in all of this. And this is crucial. You have to have that leadership and that coordination. And then, of course, we've got the combined authorities, we've got county councils. All of them need to be brought into the strategy and the plans. And, of course, at local level, and I'm now learning to call it hyper-local as a result of this panel, we do have people like Good Things Foundation, Future.now, Digital Poverty Alliance, Virgin Money Foundation, CILIP, the Library and Information Association. In their different ways in this space, they need our and the government's support and resources to carry on the work that they do. And there are many other specific policies, an agreed definition of data poverty, an assumed right to data. That's part of, if you like, digital citizenship, a digital right of way to public services. All of these were suggested by the all-party group in their 2023 report. Social tariff and data voucher auto-enrolment, because the level of take-up is so low at the moment. Making early termination of contracts free and simple. Creating a social inclusion fund, which I think is very much what the Good Things Foundation have been arguing for. Action on mid-contract price rises. All of these kind of quite granular aspects need to be dealt with. We need to bring Ofcom into the equation with their new media literacy duties under the Online Safety Act. And I very much liked Ellen's point about measurement of outcomes too. Politicians have this dreadful habit of having strategies without any measurement of the actual outcomes or a time frame within which those outcomes need to be delivered. But finally, and I think it's quite important in a digital gathering like this to make sure that the government always currently provides an analogue alternative when it delivers services. What worries me, especially as we're moving towards one login for government ID, and we're moving towards private sector digital verification, digital identity systems to a much greater extent, is that there won't be that analogue alternative for many, many people, and that will exclude them from services. So I think that's something we really do need to bear in mind, however good we get our digital access and inclusion policies, at least until we're sure that almost everybody has that kind of access and those kinds of digital services.
Thank you. From the analog to the digital, back to the analog. Full circle. Okay, I will open the floor to questions. So I don't know if maybe I will take 3 and then we answer, and then another 3. Oh, there's lots of questions. We have 10 minutes. I'll see what we can get through. I'll take one from each side of the room. One, you here in the front, and I think in the back. Yeah. Okay. If you want to start, sorry. I think you need to turn the microphone on the west. Yeah.
This working?
Yeah.
Hi, Kat Dixon from Jangala. Thank you for a really fascinating panel discussion. I was really struck by, Helen, what you said about the NHS and it being a two-tiered system amongst digital inclusion. I've just been doing research with people in temporary accommodation who have to bid for their housing for getting a permanent home once a week online. But there's no mandate to provide internet in temporary housing, and a lot of them don't have access to the internet, so they slide down the social housing list because they're digitally excluded. And I was thinking about what you said about mobile phone usage and about methods of authentication and digital IDs, and how it feels like with digital exclusion, I mean, catch-22s for people facing social disadvantage are not a new concept, but digital exclusion seems to be widening these. And it feels like we're reneging on some of our existing social contracts, like a free NHS, like the ability to apply for benefits. I guess my question is focused on regulation. Like, is there a role for regulation of public services or tech companies in this space, and should that be increased? Yes, accessibility inclusion there's definitely a rising awareness of this, and there's lots of campaigning, lots of civic society, but should there be a harsher standard if we are failing on our existing social contracts?
Thank you. This question, and I'll take it.
Louise Bennett, Director, Digital Policy Alliance. I've got a practical answer to one way we could do things. I've been thinking, where do I sit for large periods of time and I could be helped digitally? And the answer is in my doctor's waiting room, in the healthcare centre waiting room, in the hospital waiting room. And every one of those organisations has a different way of you accessing your interaction with those professionals. If you put people in those waiting spaces and said, either before or after your consultation or your meeting, we will show you how to access us digitally, it will be an enormous help, because I'm fairly digital savvy, but I lose patience with how I'm meant to interact with each different part of this, and that is not going to change in 10 years. It hasn't changed in the last 10 years, and I don't believe there'll be a common digital infrastructure. It's just a thought.
We'll comment on the thought. Thank you.
Thank you, panelists. I work at the University of Roehampton, and all people of all backgrounds can join, and that means a lot of firefighting that I do to help them. I've also lived in Nepal and in Wales, where the deprivation and that has caused a lot of digital gap, and also in Uganda, where I work through the charity. And one of the things that I come across is education and deprivation that does bring a lot of misery locally, and so as Helen said, and the hyper-local, and also integrated, because if one has to go to library, church, community center to get all different things out in all different places, that's going to be more problems. I believe the internet and all of the supports from councils could be integrated and local or hyper-local. That's, I thought. Regarding the internet, now we're talking about the contract ending, and it may be an offense to a Western liberal economy, but why does government not have internet service as a company, as a provider? Why can't they be in the market competition? Mm-hmm. Thank you.
A public service internet, I think. Why do we not have that? So we have 3 questions. I will leave it up. We'll answer those. Who wants to go first?
Shall I go first?
Yeah, if you turn on your microphone, then everybody can.
I'm the most foolhardy, so I'll tackle the first question. I mean, the widening gaps, I absolutely agree, and the dangers of that are really why I suggested a form of digital citizenship. Now, you could argue that that is regulation, and I do believe, and I don't want to anticipate the next panel, which is about AI regulation, but I do think we need proper regulation there in terms of transparency, accountability, freedom from bias, and so on. But I think this is a broader issue that there needs to be a duty, and you can see what happens when you impose a duty. The Data Protection Act way back And I think the first act was in 1984 and then 1998 and then, of course, GDPR and so on. I mean, they've had a dramatic impact on how people deal with data. And I see no reason why digital citizenship, a digital Bill of Rights, shouldn't have that kind of impact on people's ability to access. And I think that, again, if you have duties like that, it makes people like the front desk of a GP and so on think about the interoperability of what they're doing. So, if you have some kind of legal duty, maybe because I'm a legislator, I'm an optimist about regulation. I know a lot of people are very, dubious about it. They think it's, anti-innovation or whatever. But I'm a great believer in being absolutely clear that innovation has to be for public benefit and for our benefit, and that's what regulation is about. But I would like to see interoperability of standards develop explicitly as a result of that kind of entitlement to access through a Bill of Rights and digital citizenship and so on. And as far as internet
Tim, can I, because I've been told that we're running out of time, so I want to give the other panelists some time. Yeah? Okay. Helen, you jump in.
I really like, Tim, your digital right of way for public services. I think that would be wonderful. And something that I've thought about a lot is there a guaranteed percentage of spend? So if the government is spending X number of billions on digital infrastructure and digital services, that there needs to be 5%, 1% spent on digital inclusion. Obviously, with commercial companies, often we talk about levies, but I actually think this would be an area where a levy, so anyone selling things and their turnover being more than X millions of profit, then they could pay a levy. But just coming to Louise, that obviously we work a lot with hospitals, GP practices, maternity nurses, as I said. I think the question often is who pays. So they're doing that themselves because they see that there's a benefit, because actually their patients can't access the services that they need if they don't actually use their own staff to do it. But there's also this kind of very weird loop where we get money from businesses that we put into grants that then goes to a hospital to pay for the health inequalities lead to then do digital inclusion. Doesn't quite feel like quite right, but it goes back to the last question about, more your comment about integrated at hyperlocal level, and I think that kind of comes back to the public right of way to the citizens' right of way to public services, because actually if you had a national network for all, that would deal with Tim's point about analogue, that I think we might have a little bit of a debate about, but actually it would provide a place where people could go to access digital public services in an integrated way at the hyperlocal level, but it wouldn't mean that every single service needs to keep an analogue pathway.
Thank you, Lizzie. I think I'm going to give you the last word. I'm afraid we don't have more time for questions, right? So if you would like to make a final comment, and then we're going to go.
Thank you. So I think my take on these three questions fundamentally comes down to who pays and where does the money come from for the delivery of services. And the reality is that this is government, but it's also private sector. And that needs some very difficult conversations, but important and worthwhile conversations about how we bake inclusion into not only the technology, but also into the economic model. And that also means valuing activities that we possibly don't see in commercial terms as valuable. This goes to Louise's point, that it's about valuing those advocates, valuing those pathfinders, and how is that represented in this new economic model? And from there, regulation works together and we start to have a much more inclusive outlook, I think.
Thank you very much, Lizzie. There were a lot of questions, and I'm sure there's a lot of questions online as well. So I do encourage you, I think all of us would be very open to receiving questions about this and to put pressure on the relevant stakeholders. But I wanted to thank you all for listening so attentively and asking the wonderful questions that we heard, and for the panelists for participating.